Yeah, so Václav, why don't you start?
Okay, so I'm an assistant professor of English. I was hired in 2014, and I work on evolution, nature, primitivism. I just finished a book called The Evolutions of Modernist Epic. It'll be out in January with Oxford.
So same publisher.
Yeah.
We can commiserate.
They did a great job, I thought. I mean, the images.
Maybe commiserate with publishing during COVID, which is like the worst possible time, right? Nobody's
I'm sure
in the
there
book.
could be a worse time. I mean, you know, during some mass book burning purge, I guess would be worse.
Yeah.
Well, your bar is pretty low. Andreas, do you want to continue? Do you want to introduce yourself?
All right. Oh, you want me to introduce myself? Yes. Hello.
We're just going around very quickly.
Hello. I'm Andreas Killen. I teach in the history department at City College, and I help Mikhail run the Rifkind Center.
Nancy, should we introduce you? Or should you introduce yourself?
Yes, I teach at the CUNY Grad Center, and I collaborate with Victoria on various projects.
Michael?
Sure, hello. I'm Michael Neumeister. I teach in the art department at City, art history, and I'm an assistant curator at the American Federation of Arts as well. And my focus is actually on pre-war American modernism, so this is great. Thanks.
Tyler?
Hi, I'm Tyler Coburn. I teach in the art department as well, in the Department of Digital and Interdisciplinary Art Practice.
Regina? Unmute yourself.
Sorry, Regina here. I am a lecturer in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages, as well as in the Black Studies program. I teach Portuguese language classes and cultural studies. My research currently has to do with Lusophone Africa. Yes.
Ellen?
Hi, I'm Ellen Handy from the art department. I'm an art historian, and my special area is the history of photography.
Rebecca?
Hi, I'm Rebecca Plouffe. I'm in the political science department at City. I'm a political theorist. I specialize in modern political thought in particular.
Barbara?
Hi, I'm Barbara Nadale. I'm a historian of early modern Europe. I specialize in history of cities and social sciences.
Mariana and Leo? Mariana Hirsch and Leo Spitzer?
Hi, Leo.
Thank you.
Hi, Mariana Hirsch. I teach comparative literature and gender studies at Columbia. I'm a colleague of Victoria's.
Hi, I'm Leo Spitzer. I'm a historian, retired. I work on Jewish refugee memory, and with Mariana, we just finished a book on school photos in liquid time.
Thank you. Robert?
Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Higney. I teach in the English department at City College. I teach modernism and contemporary fiction primarily. And like Václav, I've also just completed a book that's titled Institutional Character. It's coming out with the University of Virginia Press next year. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Victoria actually read long ago an early version of my book's introduction. And reshaped it significantly, as a matter of fact.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, Kelly?
Yes, my name is Araceli Tinajero, and I teach in the Classical and Modern Languages Department and at the Graduate Center. And my research is on Trans-Pacific studies, among other areas that I'm also interested. And my latest book is going to come up in English with Palgrave Macmillan next year. And that's about, is entitled A History of the Spanish Speakers in Japan.
Elik, we can barely see you. You're very dark, you know, but okay.
I'll try and take care of that in a second. It's a bit dark around me. Hello, I'm Elik Elchanan. I teach in the Classic and Modern Language department as well. I teach in the Jewish Studies program, Hebrew and Yiddish literature. I work mainly on modernism in Yiddish and in Hebrew. I also recently completed a book that, COVID permitting, will come out next year about modernism, decadence, symbolism in Hebrew and Yiddish poetry. And it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Beth? You're muted.
Beth, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I've gotten too used to talking to myself. Yeah, I'm Beth Barron. I'm in the history department. I work on modern Middle East, and I'm working on a project on the history of medicine in Egypt. And I want to say hi to Marianne and Leo, who go at Dartmouth. So, hi, it's always good to see you.
Yes. Other people are not on camera. I don't know if what did you come on camera? Okay, great. Renee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Renee. Good to see everybody and to be here today. I have a variety of administrative jobs at City College, and also I'm a theater artist. I'm a playwright and a director, and have a small touring company.
Thank you. Christine?
Hi, yes, I am an English adjunct. I predominantly teach freshman composition, and I work mostly in hybrid and experimental poetics.
Lori, are you there, or?
I am here, but I'm having connectivity issues, so if it's okay, I'll stay off camera. I apologize.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm Laurie Woodard. I'm in the history department. I teach 20th century African American cultural and political history, and I'm actually in the process of the publication during COVID nightmare. So yeah, thank you so much for those encouraging words. And thank you for your wonderful piece that you submitted. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I am Michal Deckel. I'm the director of the Rifkind Center, and I teach in the English department. And I'm just thrilled to have Professor Victoria Rosner here as really our first sort of exclusive speaker who will speak exclusively to the seminar this year. Victoria Rosner is Dean of Academic Affairs at Columbia University School of General Studies. She also teaches in the Columbia University Department of English and Comparative Literature. She will be speaking about her most recent book, Machines for Living, Modernism and Domestic Life, which was just published, yes, I guess was it in the first month of COVID, March 2020, but is still making its way, is nonetheless making its way in the world. She's also the author of an earlier monograph, Modernism and Architecture of Private Life, from 2005, which won the Modernist Studies Association Book Prize. Professor Rosner is co-editor of the archive, Pioneering Women of American Architecture, and two other books of which she's the editor, The Cambridge Companion to the Bloomsbury Group, and The Global and the Intimate Feminism in Our Time. And with Professor Miller, who is also a guest here, she edits the Gender and Culture book series for the Columbia University Press. So I welcome Professor Rosner, and I've asked Professor Higney to just say a few words about Victoria's oeuvre, about her work at large, before she delves into the presentation today.
Okay, hi everybody. So one of the great rewards of studying and teaching modernism in the early 20th century is discovering both the deep familiarity and the utter strangeness of both modernist culture and the historical moment in which it flowered. The founders of modern psychology were also enthusiastic believers in and investigators of panpsychism and telepathy. The horses and mules that still carried armies into battle did so under the watchful eye of hydrogen balloons and wore gas masks to protect against chemical weapons. Many of the treaties and organizations that still govern our international relations were signed and founded, even as much of the world was still under the colonial rule of the European empires. Women and Black Americans could not vote, even as members of both groups created works of art that remain unsurpassed in the lengths to which they pushed the boundaries of aesthetic form. People came to blows over the issue of wearing masks in a pandemic. In literary studies, the powerfully defamiliarizing qualities of modernism were for many years channeled through two major presuppositions. First, a limited canon of largely white and male avant-garde writers, for example, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and William Faulkner, whose works founded a post-war modernist canon and inspired the close reading techniques that have remained fundamental to Anglophone literary studies. Second, the notion that modernism represented a moment of unprecedented rupture, a heroic, epochal break with the Victorian 19th century, after which nothing in art and culture would ever be the same. Over the past 2 decades, though, our understanding of modernism and early 20th century culture has been revolutionized by a scholarly turn known in the field as the New Modernist Studies. Work in the New Modernist Studies radically expanded the modernist canon, recognizing the importance of writers of color, people from the colonized world, and a variety of figures that earlier paradigms had excluded from study, in shaping not only the aesthetics, but also the varied politics of modernist movements. Reaching beyond literary studies and art history to the social sciences, political theory, and post-colonial approaches, New Modernist scholarship has deeply reshaped the field. It has interrogated what phenomena are captured by the term modernism, and ultimately the usefulness of the term itself in describing the global cultures of the early 20th century. I offer this context here because I can think of few scholars whose work more fully exemplifies the best of the New Modernist studies, the revolution that the field has undergone, and the ways in which modernism continues to speak to us today than our speaker, Victoria Rosner. Professor Rosner's first book, Modernism and the Architecture of Private Life, published by Columbia University Press in 2005, is a genuinely interdisciplinary study that ranges widely across literature, architectural history, design and the decorative arts, through Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Radcliffe Hall, and many more. The book's chapters give a sense of its breadth and reach beyond the literary. And the chapters are titled Kitchen Table Modernism, Frames, Thresholds, Studies, and Interiors. Taking up domesticity, a topic that would have been unassimilable to older paradigms of modernism, Professor Rosner demonstrated both the deep continuities of modernism with its precursors and successors, while at the same time capturing what remains genuinely weird and provocative about modernist art and design. The book has become essential reading for scholars of modernism, but I'd also note that it's the rare book whose rigorous scholarly interventions are presented in prose that makes its insights utterly accessible to non-specialists and is of interest to many outside of modernist studies proper. Professor Rosner's continued interest in the many fields that her first book engaged are expanded in the edited volumes, which Professor Deckel has already mentioned, the Cambridge Companion to the Bloomsbury Group, and with Geraldine Pratt, The Global and the Intimate, Feminism in Our Time. So for today, we've read a chapter from Professor Rosner's new book, whose title, Machines for Living, Modernism and Domestic Life, signals, as does her framing of modernism more broadly, both continuity and rupture with a prior body of scholarly work that has become definitional within and beyond the field. Fear in a Handful of Dust brings the strangeness and familiarity of modernism home, I think, to those of us who are here, attending the seminar, no doubt, from within our own interior spaces and in a time of pandemic. As Professor Rosner puts it, just like the modernists, we have been forced to develop, quote, a new domesticity. I look forward to thinking through her work about what the modernists have to say to those of us doing that in October of 2021. Please join me in welcoming Victoria Rosner.
Okay, so Victoria, at last, you get to talk.
Thank you,
The
Michal.
stage is yours.
Robert, thank you so much for that extraordinarily generous and erudite introduction. And thank you also to Michal and Renee for making me welcome in your seminar. I have to say, for me, the size of group where everyone can fit on one screen is really the ideal. I've come to think of it as the minion of contemporary academic life, so we can all see each other at the same time and talk to each other. And I'm so excited to be talking about this work with you and really eager for the discussion. Michal invited me to spend about 20 or 25 minutes prefacing our discussion with some framing comments. And there are four things I'd like to quickly do with you before we open it up. One is to sort of describe the broader project of the book from which the chapter you read is taken. The next is to talk a little bit about my commitments in the interdisciplinary methodology of the book, since Michal tells me that that is a topic of special interest to this group, and it is something I love to talk about. And I actually cut like 30 pages out of the introduction on interdisciplinary method because the feedback I got was that it was very boring. This is feedback with which I strongly disagree, but you got to listen to your editors. So we can talk a little bit about that. Then I want to just open up a little bit the visual archive for this chapter, which is very broad and only a tiny piece of which is represented as illustrations to the chapter itself. And finally, this is just a crazy, crazy moment to be publishing a book on domestic life. And I remain a fascinated audience member to the theater of domesticity that is on display for all of us all the time now. And I have some very initial thoughts about what the pandemic, and in particular these many, many remote conversations and opportunities for teaching and learning that we're all taking place in, have to do with the future of domesticity. So I'll close with that. So that is my my modest agenda for this afternoon. So I'll just start with a couple of broad comments about the book itself, which really started for me when I was a graduate student. And I think Robert just did such a great job of kind of like capturing this watershed moment in modernist studies. Because really when I came to the field, the biggest critique that one modernist critic would give to another is they would say, well, that's not modernism. That's not, what you're working on is not modernism. And it was this very policing kind of gesture that you still see sometimes happening in the field, but really what's happened is just this absolute explosion of material that's understood now under this, what I would say is an extremely omnivorous aesthetic of modernism in the early 20th century. So for me, the originating insight of the book was that there was a kind of received critical wisdom of a disjuncture between modernism, like high modernism, the modernist aesthetic, and the modernization, right, of domestic life. These were sort of really understood to be antithetical, that modernism really repudiated and rejected domestic life. And Christopher Reed had this great anthology about 25 years ago called Not at Home, the Suppression of Domesticity in I think Modern Art and Architecture is the title. So that modernism was understood not just to be separate from domesticity, but like explicitly rejecting of domestic life. And that was always something that really made no sense to me. And I started to learn more and more about the just cavalcade of changes that the early 20th century home went through as a social unit and then also materially. And, I have a litany of these in the book, but, the introduction of the electrification of the home, plumbing, the shrinking of the household unit, right, through the rise of birth control and families getting smaller, the end of, for the middle class, servants in the household. That meant that women were really much more, middle class women were more confined to the home and doing their own domestic work for the first time. The reorganization of household labor through mechanization. I could go on and on and on. And it seemed odd that private life, which of course, is the domain of literature by and large, that it could be reorganized in this fundamental way, and that the modernist aesthetic would be just something aside from that. So I started to look for influences, and being a modernist, I was especially interested in the impact of this reorganization of domestic life on literary form. And that is, the book is really a series of explorations, not exhaustive by any means, of this interrelationship. So the chapter that you've read is about how germ theory, right, and the dissemination of germ theory into public consciousness, shall we say the incomplete dissemination of germ theory, the still unfolding dissemination of germ theory into public consciousness, gave rise to new conceptions of domestic hygiene, and ultimately a poetics organized around and really valuing transparency and clarity, and trying to take those values and express them through literary form, right? So that's the chapter that we read for today. Other chapters really, again, start from a kind of generative moment in modernity and explore literary implications. So there's a chapter on the idea of the minimum dwelling, coined by the Czech architect Karel Tajga, and related to Adolf Loos's repudiation of ornament in architecture, right? To look at the aesthetic of removal and elimination, really, which is what both of these things have to do with, and how they're bodied forth in a whole range of modernist writers. That's another example. There's another, I'm not going to give you tons of examples, I'll do one more. Another chapter looks at the modernist novel of human development, the Bildungsroman, right, in relationship to really some radical, and now I would say pretty roundly dismissed theories of child development at the time that were very much influenced by mass production. Those of you who work, obviously for literary theorists, our ideas about psychology from the early 20th century tend to be dominated by like Freud or maybe Klein, but it's really a new age for child study in psychology, and that is the material that that chapter takes on. So all of these chapters are investigating the ways in which modernist literature develops and communicates meaning through this new vocabulary of form that I argue is derived largely from non-literary discourses of modernity. And what I find so fascinating, what I've always found fascinating, is how these ideas that are central to modernization migrate, right? Because I wouldn't say, well, it starts in this place, it goes to this other place. How they migrate across different forms of cultural production, and they change in the period of migration. So it's like almost like a kind of conversation that the culture is having with itself. I am not, as I would never claim to be, a historian of technology. So, I do a lot of archival work. I am not trying to really contribute new insights to the history of technology, but what I'm so interested in are the kind of ontological and epistemological roots or like the content within these new ideas of modernity, right? So the terms I look at are things like standardization, functionalism, rationalization, right? The elimination of ornament, hygiene, right? And how the circulation of these ideas really affects what we think it means to be human, to perceive the world, to dwell, to create. And that is obviously an interdisciplinary project, right? Just watching these ideas as they move around and find expression in literature, in theater, in art, in technology, in design, absolutely. So moving on to talking a little bit about the method. To me, it's so important in studying modernism in particular, and people in other fields can talk about the applicability of this in other periods. But modernism is this incredibly capacious aesthetic, right? We can talk about modernism in music, modernism in architecture, modernism in design, modernism in literature. But what strikes me is that there are so few conversations that look at these things together, try to look at them together in a meaningful way. And one thing I've tried to explore in recent years in my teaching is, what does it mean to talk about, for instance, modernist space and have that conversation include literature and architecture and design, right? How can we be comparative about different articulations of modernism? I think a lot of times those conversations are prevented by happening just by the disciplinary structure of the university. But to me, not to have those conversations is really to sort of be false to the entire spirit, the Gesamtkunstwerk spirit of the modernist aesthetic. So I see at least one person nodding. Okay, so like I said, I don't want to glaze you over with the interdisciplinary conversation, but I hope that's one we can return to. Let me stop what I'm talking about here and share my screen a little bit and just give a little bit of the sense of the visual archive, which I think is also pertinent to the conversation about interdisciplinary method for this chapter. So, okay, bear with me for a second here. There we go. Okay, so now you should all be seeing a title slide. I can see Michal, she's nodding. Okay, we're good. So let's shift to talking about cleanliness and dirt. The chapter is about germ theory and the advent of germ theory. And one of the things I argue is that the advent of germ theory causes this kind of like startling reevaluation of what it means to be dirty and what it means to be clean, right? Because with the discovery that it's microbial life that can cause dangerous diseases, suddenly you can see this somewhat dismayed looking housewife. There's this realization that you can't really tell what's clean and what's dirty. You need a disapproving expert here. And I love the way that the expert here, he looks obviously very disapproving, but also he's holding a little pair of eyeglasses, which to me is so important because one of the things that one of the qualities that seems to be attributed to experts in germ theory at the time is the capacity for this extension of vision. This guy can see what the rest of us can't see. I don't know if the eyeglasses are going to help him do it, but to me it's suggestive of the notion that the expert can discern what's dirty, and there's a kind of shaming of the housewives who are then being told, you know, you've really got to up your game. You've got to, you think you knew what was clean, you think you were keeping your family safe? No, I'm sorry. And this picture from 1918, of course, is, you know, happening at the same time as the flu pandemic, which we've heard so much about in recent months, so much more deadly than COVID, and like COVID, no treatment except for public health measures. Okay, so the lexicon of advertising is rich on this topic, but I wanted to just put this out there because we've heard so much about disinfectants in recent months, and the idea that Lysol is appropriate for feminine hygiene, to me, is suggestive of the kind of moral impetus to see hygiene and the rationalization of the home almost as a way of taming femininity, right? That those are the germs that we need to be really killing. And one of the interesting texts that I discovered in my research on this chapter was Jean Broadhurst's Home and Community Hygiene, which I mentioned briefly in the chapter. And this is a book that really is part of the genre of advice to homemakers, which was, you know, obviously very popular earlier in the 19th century. Lots and lots of advice guides always, but they take on a very different valence and set of topics in the early 20th century. Really asking the homemaker to think of herself as a scientist, to the extent that, again, she's got to have her focus on these deadly but invisible germs. So to have this is the frontispiece for a book on house cleaning, to me suggests a real shift. And I want to show you just a couple of images that Jean Broadhurst uses in Home and Community Hygiene to demonstrate the necessity of microbial house cleaning, as impossible as that is. So she looks through her microscope, and she wants to show the homemakers what she's seeing. This says bacteria from spoiled tomatoes, showing numerous little extensions called flagella, right? So I think there's a kind of gross out thing that's happening here. Like, this is what's in your tomatoes if you could only see. Or this one from lettuce, some of the water used in washing lettuce was added to this plate of agar. The above indicates the need for thorough washing of such vegetables. The message again being, you don't know what's clean, and you will never know what's clean, but I can show you. Here, comparing the efficacy of various means of cleaning and urging the homemaker towards mechanization, more germs with a dry broom, fewer with a damp broom, and the fewest with the new technology of vacuum cleaners. So, the broader context for this is the total redesign of the kitchen in the period, and the way that the kitchens was advised to emulate, kitchen design was advised to emulate the design of the laboratory, right? So if you remember in the picture from the Saturday Evening Post, lots of drapery, lots of fabrics, but in this modern hygienic kitchen, right, you have these plain surfaces that that are both efficient and should be able to render visible to the homemaker, any lurking germs. So we have this increasing emphasis on the visual and on being able to see, and how vision is going to make you safe, and vision is going to help you identify dangers in your environment. And to me, this is all kind of comes together very beautifully in this gorgeous, gorgeous official poster for the first International Hygiene Exhibition staged in Dresden in 1911. And the graphic itself is from Franz von Stuck. So this was the first International Hygiene Exhibition, a World's Fair focusing on modern technology, medical science, and public health. And you have this kind of all-seeing eye, as the image for public hygiene. As I talk about in the chapter, alongside the emphasis on vision is this new taste for glass, right? Glass as a metaphor of transparency, as this new kind of engineered material that can be worked into architecture in different ways. This is Bruno Taut's famous glass pavilion from 1914 that was really designed to showcase what was possible in glass design. And part of why glass was considered so great to use was because it made things visible, right? It enhanced the potential for things to be seen. And so you got all these kinds of very creative uses of glass. Bruno Taut, the famous glass skyscraper, unbuildable, right? Designed by Mies van der Rohe in 1922. So never built, but a vision for what it would be wonderful to be able to do. And then another, and it was Jeffrey Schnapp who pointed this out to me, but another piece from a hygiene exhibition, the transparent man. The idea, again, I talk a little bit in the book about X-rays, and Beatrice Colomina has done some recent work on X-ray architecture, but the fantasy of making the interior of the body visible, and in this sense, bringing it under control, making it safe, making it clean. The Transparent Man from 1927. And related to that, the Transparent Engine, okay, again on display at a hygiene exhibition in Dresden a few decades later. Not a practical thing, right, a transparent engine, but bodying forth a system of values, I think, about the desirability of sensory extension and visual extension. And then to me, of course, and this will be familiar to all of you, but the great statement of transparency and visibility in domestic architecture is Mies van der Rohe's famous Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, built in the 40s. The Farnsworth House is the most radical vision of domestic life. Everything visible all the time. And as Alice Friedman has pointed out in her incredible book, Woman and the Making of the Modern Home, the Farnsworth House was carried out for a woman client, Dr. Edith Farnsworth, who commissioned the house from Mies and then got into a long series of battles with him about it. But this idea that everything in your home should be visible at all times, right, is just something that I think has taken on a particular valence for us during COVID that I will come back to in just a second. Okay, I'm gonna share again in 1 minute, but I can stop just for now, because the last thing that I want to talk to you about before we get to the discussion is this question that I think is suggested in the Farnsworth House of what is happening to our understanding of domestic life right now. And this is obviously not something I take up in the book. I did not anticipate the COVID pandemic in the book. I do have a side project on Ebola that we can talk about separately, but now looking back on the book through the lens of COVID and thinking about the extent to which the germ theory and the 1918 flu pandemic really helped to reorganize domestic life, you have to wonder about the long-term impacts of the situation, the pandemic that we are living through right now. For me, you know, in meetings like this one, it is extraordinary the extent to which we don't need glass anymore to enhance visibility. We have this technological prosthetic called Zoom that allows us in many cases to look into each other's homes. You know, we are showing each other our beautiful babies, our partners. Our domestic lives are more or less on display. Some people you look at it, and I know we've all had the voyeuristic experience of looking into each other's Zoom windows and thinking, where is my colleague living? What are they doing? What is that in the background? What am I seeing? And then we see other people whose Zoom windows are very perfectly composed and they have certain books in the background, and you get the feeling that they are really trying to present to you a kind of self-portrait of themselves, you know, in the domestic setting. The green screen feature, and thank you to Václav for showing us this, also allows, I think, for some really aspirational settings. So if you don't want to show yourself in your home, you still show a kind of fantasy of where you might like to be or where you would like other people to see you as being. That's a different kind of statement about domesticity. And then I don't know if any of you are familiar with the media of TikTok, right? But this also has been, during the pandemic, a place where people have articulated certain fantasies and ideas about domestic life, showing off what they most enjoy in their homes, you know, showing some vision of family life, that then the idea is to attract as many views as possible. So exposure is a constant theme, sometimes messy, dirty, difficult exposure. I don't know if you've seen media coverage of the TikToks that Kellyanne Conway's daughter is making, trying to kind of, you know, out her mother and undermine some of the political messaging of the Trump administration. So using the domestic scene to kind of subvert the glossy image of a polished political life. The image I want to actually close with, and I could go on and on, but the image I want to close with is a website that a colleague of mine at Gettysburg College put together in response to the pandemic. I don't know if any of you have seen this. Let me see if I can figure out how to share this. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so this is an art project, I guess you would call it. It's called Decameron Row, after Boccaccio's, you know, famous Decameron, in which a group of friends run away to the country and tell each other stories to wait out another pandemic, the plague. And in Decameron Row, each window tells a story. So you can mouse over the windows and you see the name of the person who supposedly lives in that window, and you click on it, which I'm not going to do right now, but you're obviously welcome to check it out. And you'll watch a short video that the mostly writers, artists, filmmakers, some designers, chefs have prepared for you. I think it just makes the domestic exposure of this moment so literal, right? Here are all these people from all over the world, right, from every continent, imagined as living together, right, in this enormous domestic unit that is an imaginary creation of the pandemic. We have the idea that we are all separate, but all sort of sharing space together. And behind every window is a story. And you can click on the window and you can go in and you can hear the story, right? This is radical exposure. It is absolute collapse between private and public life. In these windows, we're still doing our work. We're raising our families, we're eating, we're sleeping, all the habits of domestic life, but everything amalgamated together. And I'm really interested to see what this domestic moment and the new visibility of domestic life is going to bring about. So I leave you on to Cameron Rowe.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosner. I want to open the room apropos to discussion. If people don't mind, please use the hand raising tool, just so I see you more clearly. Oh yeah, Václav.
Okay, I didn't really want to butt in with the first question, but I did have the hand raising tool ready. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, wonderful presentation. I love the project, the Decameron Row. I think that's such a great idea. I'm going to check it out after this. So my question's maybe a slightly boring one. It's really, when I think about hygiene in modernism, for me it's impossible not to think about eugenics and social hygiene. And especially when I see an advert like the exhibition of international hygiene, I immediately think of national hygiene. This is because I've been working on evolution a lot, probably. But then reading your chapter, and I confess I haven't read the whole book, so maybe you talk about this somewhere else. I was expecting a discussion of hygiene in relation to T.S. Eliot, who had his own sympathies for eugenics, especially in his private writings and his letters. But instead of talking about Eliot's eugenics, you move on to talk really well about William Carlos Williams. I'm actually quite glad you did, but I would be curious to hear your insight into the relation between Eliot's germ phobia and his ideas about cultural and poetic hygiene, especially in something like 4 Quartets, where he talks about purifying the dialect of the tribe, right? He picks up that phrase from Mallarmé, and it really is slightly eerie at the moment when that poem is written in relation to his friendship with Pound and others. So it's something that I'm wondering about. It's not a very clear question, sorry.
No, I think it's a great question, and I get into it a little bit, I think, in talking about Pound, but I mean, all of this discourse of hygiene definitely has a very troubling set of social valences attached to it, and I think this material has been pretty well covered in the scholarship. I mean, Anna Brickhouse writes about it. Anne McClintock got us started thinking about soap ads and the kind of racial purification that attends on them. And, I think one of the things I liked about Williams is that I feel like, for whatever reason, he doesn't go there with cleaning, right? Maybe because he's a doctor, maybe because I can't tell you why, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's no question that when you're talking about cleaning, it's a very easy slide to make into purification, which in this period is always going to be a racial construct. And I think there are very few modernists who don't dip into that discourse at certain points. I do tend to feel that that is a story that has been pretty thoroughly told in modernist studies. Lots of great critics, right, especially on the Americanist side, writing about it. And so I think I was trying to just talk about archival material that just seems less discussed. But that doesn't mean that that's not another really important part of the story. I don't know if there are particular parts and pieces in Eliot you want to get into.
I suppose maybe the most interesting.
He runs a lot through the book in general.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe the most interesting thing to me is that it is actually possible to talk about the two things separately, where previously my assumption would have been that you can't talk about domestic hygiene without talking about social hygiene, cultural hygiene, population hygiene, national hygiene, and so forth, that this is really one concept. Actually, your book sort of shows to me that you can really quite successfully and well, and I like that about it.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think what what might be a little different about what I'm trying to do is that I'm really, really anchored in the materiality of hygiene, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, to get into the stories about purification and racial cleansing, you've gone pretty far away from asepsis and into, metaphor and social theory. I am really staying with soap, right? Yeah. And interested in the material underpinnings of hygiene and asepsis and the elimination of germs and the instruments that we use to do that, and the machines, and so maybe that, which I said is, as I said, is less explored material. I mean, I think it's a great question, especially if you look at like an important historian of technology like Siegfried Gideon, right, who really starts our conversations about the history of mechanization. Yeah. Mm. To me, it's a little bit more questionable how he is able to avoid those kinds of issues, but maybe it's an interesting conversation to think about the material and the metaphorical in all of these concepts.
Right, right.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Oh, other people? Yeah, actually.
Yes, Latin American modernism is before American modernism. So this movement goes from roughly from 1880 to 1914. But the writers also had the same problems and the same challenges because of due to the change of the technological changes, and also because of there was a disruption between the domestic and the public, because we had the construction of hospitals. All of a sudden, mothers had to leave their house to go there and everything. So, what I want to say is that right now, for us, when we study modernism, we also have to take into account the technological changes that took place, and also they are related to medicine as well, to the history of medicine, because of the hygiene that was imposed in cities, like cities like Latin American cities, because they used to go to public baths because there were no baths in their house. So just a side comment. Thank you.
No. I can't say enough about the introduction of indoor plumbing, which is so uncommon, in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's almost unheard of, right? And so the, bathroom appliances almost as like fetishes, and certainly like these just objects of immense cultural interest and value, and to watch the assimilation of indoor plumbing into a culture really is to track very, concomitant changing ideas about health and about sex and about privacy and the body. It's a big difference when you're, can shower at long intervals, or bathe at long intervals, or when that's happening in public, or, I love this. I have a story in the book about when Virginia Woolf first gets a flush toilet. That's big stuff. And I wonder if you feel like, if you think that you can track that in literature in the Latin American context.
Well, yes, but since our modernists were before the American modernists, their fear with technology was that the camera was invented, the film was invented, so they thought that literature was going to disappear because all of a sudden you could film everything. So they used to live with this fear all the time, thinking that that technology was going to absorb the humanities, and all of a sudden they were going to be left to do something that had to do with science or something like that. So it's very interesting. But again, as Professor, the professor that introduced you, I apologize, I need my glasses. I said, thank you, I apologize. I'm very bad with names. What I was gonna say. But anyway, so this interplay between technology and aesthetics is very interesting. Oh yes, what I was gonna say is that our study of the Latin American modernists has been transformed in the last 2 decades too. Before, we never thought about putting them together or talk about interdisciplinarity or anything like that. And there are a lot of studies about the domesticity, but more looking at artifacts that deal with transnational artifacts that people used to acquire in their house. So it's very interesting not to see the connection here. Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Yeah, Tyler?
Hi, Victoria. Thank you so much for your talk. I had an observation and then also a question for you. I'm happy that you brought up Colomina's X-ray architecture because I found myself returning to that scholarship earlier in the pandemic when I was doing some research into sanatoria. And as you probably know, she focuses a lot on alto sanatoria. And some of the furniture that he built, for instance, his Paimio chair, first began as sanatoria furniture, and then this furniture was later integrated into the home. So I just thought it was interesting to consider as a sort of complement to how you were talking about the laboratory as being a sort of template for the modernist kitchen. Think also about the extent to which sanatoria design of the modernist era ends up becoming inflected in domestic architecture. And I imagine that you probably know more about that than me, and if you have any insights, I'd love to hear them. And then the question that I have is partly based on the really astute observation that you made about how, to a certain extent, the Zoom window provides a type of transparency more than glass, right? And sort of giving us vantage points into one another's domestic spaces. And I feel like taking that observation a step further is the question, how might the architecture of domestic space begin to adapt to these new conditions of visibility? And I think composing for the Zoom frame is obviously one example. Like, my computer is on a shoebox to create more vertical lines behind me, which I imagine somehow helps the telepresence effect. There was an article in the Times this morning about how hotels are thinking of redesigning themselves to sort of accommodate the realities of this moment, and some imaginings, not just a practical redesign, but redesign of their built form. So yeah, I guess that's my question. Given that you've been thinking so much about the sort of transformation of domestic space of a previous era, do you have any prognostications about what some of the other effects on the built environment of domestic space could be from this pandemic we find ourselves in?
These are amazing, amazing questions that I am writing down. So first about sanatoria, right? I mean, I don't know that people appreciate the effect, the extent to which tubercular sanatoria were this kind of shaping influence on modern architecture. And the cover of my book, which I have next to me in case I need to look at it, actually has this, this image from Osbert Lancaster of a kind of classic modernist design, but the integration of inside and outside and the use of the sleeping porch, and you see these two people on the roof sleeping, is an absolute tubercular influence, right? Because that was a big part of the cure for people with tuberculosis at the time, was they were supposed to go outside and lie on these porches and, you know, wrapped up in robes and just take in the air. The idea was that, and this was really kind of a holdover from miasma and the idea that germs circulated in the air and you had to have clean air. So being able to go inside and outside was really important. And that really fed into a lot of modernist design. So, I mean, I think, you know, as Tyler's pointing out, you have to look for the influence of medicine and medical care on design and domestic life, but it is really there when you start to look for it. And then about the Zoom windows, I mean, I just feel like this is such an interesting moment. It's such a transitional moment. I mean, I don't know about you all, I was really kind of captivated by the spectacle of Chris Cuomo in his basement with COVID, you know, and kind of putting himself on display and his, you know, his body suffering and going through and showing and continuing to broadcast through that. It was such a, it seemed to me, such a raw, uncomposed image. I thought, this can't last, right? What we're going to see is people are going to kind of get hold of the iconography of the Zoom and are going to produce more and more, you know, carefully images that really body forth the face that they want to show to the rest of the world. You know, Chris Cuomo is going to come out of his basement and he's going to, you know, and now, and you still see, I think, a lot of newscasters coming to us from their kitchens, right? So, I mean, I think one thing that has to be happening is an interesting destabilization of the boundaries between professional and private life. Now, this is good news and bad news, right? It's bad news for people who are trying to manage domestic responsibilities and professional responsibilities in the same space at the same time. I am one of them. It can't really be done, you know, so that has to be understood. It's bad news, I know, I'm sure you all have this experience too with your students who really feel concerned that they are unable to present a suitable portrait of domestic life in their Zoom window when they attend class. And so they don't want to have their cameras on, and, you know, they don't want to, it's not the version of themselves that they want to make visible as they come forward as students. So they're asking, you know, for a better separation between that professional and personal identity, and they can't manage it. So I just feel like lots of interesting and sometimes very troubling negotiations of that divide. That's, I mean, I don't know how, that's not very deep, but I think it's an open question for all of us, and it's one that's rapidly changing.
It reminds me of the section in Infinite Jest where the telephone gets invented, and to begin with, people talk with their image, but then they get better images of themselves to project, and they get better and better until finally it gets so traumatic that they go back to just the sound telephone because it's just too much.
Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you for the chapter. I really enjoyed reading it. I was maybe most interested in the piece, in the relationship that gets established between experts and non-experts around the rise of germ theory. And oddly enough, that called to mind for me a sort of strange point of reference that to me seems very parallel, oddly. So there's all this attention to like the capacity of the expert to see beyond the surface, to see the sort of threat lurking underneath that non-experts don't have access to. And to my mind, that suggests a kind of almost like ancient Platonic fear about the capacity of the expert to see the essence behind the form that the many are sort of easily confused by or duped by. And that is obviously an odd sort of thing to have called to mind by a chapter on modernism, that I should be sort of thinking about Plato in that way. But of course, light metaphors and the importance of clarity and vision are part of that discourse in very rich ways too. And so I wondered if there was maybe something like surprisingly modern about antiquity at that level, or something oddly ancient about modernity in that respect, or if it's just kind of like a paradox that the introduction of new forms of technology should I don't know, just reinscribe the challenge of seeing beyond appearances and down to the level of like truth or essence, or, you know, the reality of things that's available to experts, but not non-experts?
That's such a wonderful question. I think what it really, what feels perhaps a little bit more specific to the early 20th century moment, if anything does, is the organization of expertise through a professional hierarchy, right? So we're not here talking about, you know, the wisdom of just a wise person, you know, someone who someone who can really see into things because of their inherent capabilities. We're talking about people who have been groomed to expertise through you know, professional hazing, right? That they've attended particular kinds of schools, that they wear a white coat, they have certain tools of the trade, and it's the credentialing as an expert through professionalism, right? Which really, I think, is a pretty much of a mid to late 19th century phenomenon in terms of creating the, you know, the hierarchy of the professions and having examinations and, you know, rituals you need to go through to credential yourself as a profession, as a professional. That feels a little bit specific to this moment. So what is the particular insight of the doctor? What is the particular insight of the scientist? What is the particular insight of the architect? And all these things feel slightly different, feel differentiated in this period. So I think that's the piece that feels specific. I'm sorry, Andreas, did you want to have something to add to that?
Thanks for a great talk, Victoria. I love that you begin with Adolf Loos and you carry that story forward into the 20s. Many, many years ago, probably like 30 years ago, when I entered graduate school, I was convinced I was going to write a dissertation on Adolf Loos, but that got left by the wayside. And it's been a long time since I've read his stuff. But anyways, I absolutely agree with the way in which, you know, you start there and move on into the discourse of hygiene and transparency. Well, I guess what I'm wondering is how far forward you carry that story. I mean, because, you know, by the middle of the 20th century, there is, in many philosophical and other traditions, a kind of mounting backlash against the ideology of transparency. I mean, I think it, you know, becomes very pronounced with people like Canguilhem and Foucault and others, but you can see signs of that already in the 30s. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you pay attention to in your novel. What expressions of skepticism or suspicion or resistance you uncover in your research?
That's such, yeah, I mean, certainly I felt that Foucault was like looking over my shoulder a little bit, you know, as I was writing about glass and transparency, because, you know, certainly it's a technology that can be put to very troubling uses, and, you know, with surveillance. My book doesn't go that far, you know. I think I'm just much more focused on this moment when this new technology feels like it has this potential to expand the senses, and like the, you know, like Mies and the fantasy of a world made of glass, and its kinds of extensive powers. But these are fantasies, right? They're not, and they're focused, they're located in domestic space, right? So there's, again, this kind of concomitant illusion of privacy. You know, so, you know, the reading of the chapter, I think I have the William Carlos Williams reading of the chapter of the poem, The Lily, in the chapter. And what you have is the poet looking out the window, right? But no one can look in. No one is using that to kind of invade someone else's privacy and observe someone unawares. All of the descriptions of glass and looking that I talk about are giving the individual the ability to look out or look forward, or to look within in the case of the X-ray. But I think that would be a really interesting kind of next chapter when we're writing a cultural history of glass, which I think would be a very good thing to write, actually.
Lori?
Hi. thank you again for this wonderful piece. I preface my comments on with two things. One, my question is very similar to Andreas's, and two, I am not using my camera, as I said, because of a technological thing. I'm on my phone and it just won't work. But I am somebody that is like, the, conflation of private and public is a terrible, terrible thing, right? And I was wondering if, Andreas was asking about skepticism. I'm asking about, sort of pushback, resistance to this, transformation. Does it happen? And then is there, because I hear, it's like, it's adaptability, it's transformation, it's this new thing. But is there room for a resistance to that? Or is that just sort of, you're old school and we have nothing to say to you?
No, I mean, I would say that, the limit is inherent, right? I mean, the idea that I talk about in the chapter is that glass and sensory extensions are total failures in the face of infectious pathogens, right? No matter how good your glass is, or no matter how strong your contact lenses are, you're not going to be able to see germs. You're not going to be able to tell if your kitchen is dirty or clean, by the standards of an infectious disease specialist. So, on the one hand, there's this tremendous optimism and pleasure in the idea of sensory extension, but, it's always just a defense against something impossible, which is being able to identify what dangerous dirt is. And, I think we've all actually had to go through this experience, especially in the early days of COVID, when there was not so much clarity about, I shouldn't even use that word, there was not a refined understanding about the threat of contagion from COVID through surfaces. And everyone was telling us to sanitize our groceries because, it was impossible to know. So the pleasure in sensory extension is always inadequate, and it's always defensive in the context of germ theory. So yeah, there's no real basis for optimism. There's just a kind of human struggle against impossible limits.
Thank you.
Maybe to build on what Laurie's question, I'm thinking that in the current moment, what it means to be germ-free, or what it means to be clean or unclean. I mean, that's a kind of contested site, right? It's a contested site of different opinions, different schools of thought, different experts. And I'm wondering if you see that battleground in the material that you work on, because it seems to me, from what I've read, it seems to be a fairly uniform sample. If you see this as a battleground, and how that gets translated into the literature that you work on.
The battle over the presence or absence of germs.
And the meaning of cleanliness, the need for cleanliness, the rejection of those disciplinary methods.
Yeah, I mean, this is just what's amazing is that the disputes that we have today are just they're just absolute mirror images of what was happening in the 1920s after the flu, right? I mean, there were public health experts who were saying, the only thing you really need to protect yourself from the flu is, robust, good health and fresh air, and that's it. And the rest of this is all silly. And then there were people who were talking about, you've got to wash your hands, you've got to wear a mask. And in the chapter, I attribute this a little bit to, the relatively recent dissemination of germ theory, which is maybe, 40 years old or so, depending on how you clock it, at the time that the flu pandemic starts. But then to see these debates recapitulated in contemporary political discourse, like unchanged, right? You realize you're not dealing with a response to technology. You're dealing with just, you know, a resistance to an admission of a loss of control, right? I didn't say that very well, but it's a kind of ontological challenge and not really a history of science challenge. It's being unwilling to say there are forces in my environment that I cannot defend myself against, and I have to respond in a protective way, or I refused to take that on. I refused to assimilate that, and I would rather just walk among the risks and deny their existence. It's the same debate.
Right, but you see that debate sort of projected onto the aesthetic, I mean, onto literature, onto
well, Ibsen's so great, right? Like I use the Ibsen example in the chapter, and that's still my favorite, from Enemy of the People, where, I mean, it's the same story, that the scientist in town knows that there's typhus in the water, and the mayor, the politician, is just like, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it. So you get it on the level of representation, like the story actually being told, and then you get it on the level of metonymy, right, where it gets symbolized and reenacted through, you know, just an interplay of influences, like in Williams, an image is poetry.
Right. Robert?
Yeah. In the chapter that we read for today, Victoria, there's a great brief like excursus into fashion, right? About the trimming of beards and the raising of hemlines on skirts and things like that. And there's also a great recent book in Modernist Studies by Lily Sheehan called Modernism à la mode, that's about modernist fashion, which has nothing to say about the pandemic or questions of hygiene and health, really very little. And I was curious if there's more elsewhere in your new book, or just stuff that didn't get in there about the repercussions for fashion of germ theory.
Well, this is the only chapter in the book on germ theory, right? The other chapters all take up totally different ideas from modernization, but I would be fascinated to read more of that and to be able to think of it. Again, it's to what extent are we willing to look at these different discourses of modernization as all part of like a single, or a set of stories, not a single story, but a set of stories, right? So it's not what, I mean, we haven't really had the interdisciplinary conversation, but it's not what we're trained to do. We're trained to look at fashion as its own discipline, right? Its own, and when you go to the V&A or other costume museums and things, you don't really necessarily get those contexts established. But it was very important for fashion at the time, and not just personal fashion, but also home design and decoration, and the elimination of textiles, right? So you didn't want to have curtains or drapes or things hanging on the floor because they were all considered, you know, possible hideouts for germs and disease. And this is all fantasized, right? I mean, your germ can be in your beard, it can be on your face. I don't know that there's any health value to not having facial hair, but it's a fantasy of protection, something to do. So I don't work more on that, but I would love to see that work done, because I think it is a really interesting connection.
And maybe now is the time to have the interdisciplinary conversation, because I think one of the things that I really appreciated about your book at large is your method of, and as you said, in response to Václav's question as well, I mean, you resist the metaphorical to an extent anyway, and you really stay with the material. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that means to do literary criticism with this resistance and from this vantage point of working with the material, and how that work translates into writing about words and sentences and literary aesthetic.
Yeah, and I think the question I wrote, because I always have the problem, and I don't know if any of you who work in interdisciplinary contexts have this problem, but students come to me and they say, well, how do I learn to do this, right? How do I study and prepare if I'm an English major, right? And I feel like I don't have a good answer for them. I don't know that I feel that there's a path I can tell them to walk. I mean, I think for me, it's really just been following my interest and following the material. You know, I mean, I really started out with this very basic observation about the significance of architectural space in modernist literature, and just wanting to run that to ground from a material perspective, really trying to understand what that means and understanding how important the material contexts were in the period because of this rapid changes in technology, and trying to imagine what it was like to live through that, and not knowing a better way to get at it than to go in the archives and actually understand what people's homes were like and how rapidly they changed. But that for me was a totally individual mission. Yeah, someone can help us.
Yeah, but how do you go from there to writing, to then taking, I mean, you go and you immerse yourself in modernist architecture, but then how do you go from there and take that extra step of writing about literature in this context?
I mean, yeah, for me, it's like I just try to imagine the conversation. And a lot of times the conversation has historical roots, right? So you find that a writer who seems interested in these ideas, like I talk about in the minimum writing chapter, I talk about Ivy Compton Burnett, right? Whose domestic partner was a design historian, right? And so I was able to go through her partner's papers, and there was the roots of the influence on her work. So it was like very, very direct and sort of biographical. But I think you also have to have an interest, and I think I talked about this at the beginning, in understanding how ideas change when they migrate across disciplinary forms. To me, that is an endlessly fascinating question. So what is hygiene, to take the example of this chapter, what could that mean in poetry, right? Like, it's a term that comes up all the time, but what could it mean for poetic form? And just being interested in posing those kinds of questions about how ideas move among these different registers and how they're transformed by the journey. I love those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that as a maker, I'm a screenwriter and filmmaker participating in, I'm married to a scholar, so I understand the conversation, but you know, for me, I found a lot of just pleasure in your writing and making the connections between an architectural model and a poetic model. And what it does for me as a maker is it just asks me to kind of interrogate what a form can and cannot do. So thinking about how glass can reveal, but also, like you say, ultimately conceal. And so then I just map that onto poetry. What does poetry both reveal and conceal? And so that just helps give me ideas about like how I might approach form from a maker's perspective. So thank you.
It's so often a question that's, I think, most congenial in the context of form, right? Because, you know, form can mean so many different things. I think that's why my book ended up being about literary form, because it's such a container for ideas.
Argeli, did you want to add something?
And then Rebecca, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Or anybody really.
Oh. No, I edited a book on technology and culture. So I approached several historians, and I approached historians, economists, actually, an economist, and I wanted him to talk about the economy, but through literature. So it took me a while to explain to him what I wanted, and I didn't want to, in a statistical chapter, I wanted him to borrow examples of literature to bring into his narrative. So that was very helpful. You know, that was a tremendous, great exercise. Thank you.
I had that problem. I had that problem with economists too when I worked on the Bloomsbury group, because I really wanted to use the same method to think about the Bloomsbury group, which is a very interdisciplinary group of individuals, and which prominently featured the economist Maynard Keynes. And the hardest challenge I had was finding someone who really understood Keynes's economic theory and could talk about it as part of the oeuvre of the Bloomsbury group, which is usually understood through aesthetics. And I just thought, well, you know, economics can have aesthetic dimensions, right? That was hard to get at. The economists are like tough nut to crack.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I just had a very brief sort of comment thought that was that brought to mind by the conversation about the migration of ideas across disciplines. And it seems to me, so there was an earlier discussion about the difference between working with working within the language of materiality versus like within the language of metaphor and figuration. And it occurs to me that thinking about ideas migrating from one discipline to another, you know, or transferring from one discipline to another, one, you know, modification of form into another, seems to me like a kind of, one could describe metaphor as exactly the process of transference, transferring like one set of, you know, one form into another, transferring X into Y. And so I wonder, it just seems to me that there's a kind of like quiet metaphoric dimension to what you're describing in that small way, maybe.
Yeah, that is the meaning of the metaphor, to carry from one place to another. So yeah, of course you can't ever not be in metaphor. I think that's totally right.
Any other questions, comments?
I'm interested in hearing about other people's interdisciplinary practices, and if you have a similar process, or how you, if not, you know, what you see as the challenges and limits of that.
I mean, in part, the Rifkind seminar was formed for this purpose. I mean, it was so there's for kind of cross-fertilization between disciplines. And it has been, I think it's been very successful in helping people sort of learn about paradigms of other disciplines and then take them and use them in their own work. So there have been a few publications related to that, but I don't know, somebody want to have anything you could say about that?
Or about helping students with it, because I always find that is like, it's hard to be encouraging, I find. I mean, I want to be encouraging.
Right. It's also hard in terms of the way the discipline and the profession is organized. It's to encourage them, of course. Not that that's their job anyway, but.
I think there's something that might be added in relation to this book. About interdisciplinarity. I mean, in relation to science and literature, up until a certain point, interdisciplinarity kind of meant that you're going to talk about the social construction of various phenomena, right? At least this is my reading about evolution. The scientists are always worried that you're going to say that some physical phenomenon is actually socially constructed, and then you're going to get into an argument between the settlement of the social and the natural. But here, talking about germs, or about the kind, I mean, there's a sort of new materialist approach in your book, right? Which talking about germs allows you to talk about the actual germs in different disciplines. And I think I see that as something new. I think that's quite interesting.
Right. Well, this seems like actually a great comment to end with. It's 2:00 or 1:56. Victoria, thank you so much for sharing your incredible work.
Thank you all so much. It's really been such a pleasure.
Wonderful to
looking into all your Zoom windows.
Right, our curated Zoom windows. So I wanted to remind everyone that our next talk is on November 6th, and it's going to be a talk about race, the healthcare system, and the pandemic with Jonathan Metzel and Donna Davis. And I will see you then. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.